Iran just broke a record that should shock every single person on this planet, and most people have no idea it happened. In 2025, the Iranian regime executed over 2,100 of its own people, not in a decade, not over several years, in a single year. And according to a brand new report from Amnesty International, that number was so staggering, so completely off the charts, that it pushed the total number of executions across the entire globe to a 44-year high, the highest recorded since 1981. Let that sink in for a moment. We are living in the most technologically advanced era in human history, and yet state-sanctioned killings just hit numbers we haven't seen in over 4 decades. So what exactly is going on inside Iran, and why did the killings suddenly accelerate so dramatically? Let's break this down, because the full picture here is deeply disturbing, and the world deserves to know what's really happening.
Amnesty International released their annual global death penalty report, and the findings are nothing short of alarming. Across 17 countries combined, at least 2,707 people were executed in 2025. That's a 78% spike from the 1,519 confirmed executions recorded in 2024, a 78% jump in just 1 year. But here's the part that stops you cold. Iran alone was responsible for 2,159 of those executions. Nearly 80% of every documented execution on the planet last year happened inside one country, Iran. One country, almost 80% of the world's known executions. To put this in perspective, Iran's execution count in 2025 was more than double what it carried out in 2024, when authorities put at least 972 people to death. Doubling that number in a single year is not a policy adjustment. That is an escalation. That is a regime turning up the dial on fear and force at a level that human rights organizations are calling unprecedented in modern history. Here's what's really happening, and this is the part most mainstream coverage glosses over. The executions in Iran are not simply about punishment for crime. They are, according to multiple human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, a calculated political tool. The Iranian regime has been using the death penalty at an industrial scale to silence dissent, crush opposition, and instill fear in a population that has, for years now, been pushing back against the government. Since the historic Woman Life Freedom protests that swept the country in 2022, the authorities have dramatically escalated the use of capital punishment, and the strategy, experts say, is deliberate. By creating an atmosphere where people see 4 or 5 of their fellow citizens killed by the state every single day, the government is sending a message: protest, and this is what awaits you. And then came June 2025, and everything intensified.
When hostilities erupted between Iran and Israel in June 2025, the Iranian regime did not slow down its internal killing machine. It accelerated it. Amnesty International's data tells an extraordinary story. Between January and June of 2025, Iran recorded 654 executions. But between July and December, after the war began, that number exploded to 1,505, more than double in the back half of the year alone. Senior Iranian judicial officials reportedly called for expedited trials and executions for anyone suspected of supporting or collaborating with hostile states. The revolutionary courts, special tribunals that handle national security cases and drug offenses, courts that human rights groups have long condemned for denying defendants basic fair trial rights, became the engines of this acceleration. Most people miss this part. The revolutionary courts in Iran operate largely in secrecy. Trials can last as little as 5 minutes. Defendants are often denied access to their lawyers for months or even years, and forced confessions, extracted through what rights organizations describe as torture, beatings, and prolonged isolation, are routinely used as evidence to secure death sentences. When the state decides it wants someone dead, the machinery exists to make it happen with almost no meaningful legal barrier. Consider the case of Behrouz Ehsani and Mehdi Hassani, 2 men who had been inside prison protesting the death penalty. Every Tuesday for 18 months, they went on hunger strike as part of a campaign called No to Execution Tuesdays. In July 2025, they were executed. Their trial reportedly lasted 5 minutes. They were not allowed to speak in their own defense. Their families were not notified before it happened. According to Amnesty International, forced confessions extracted through torture were used to convict them. And that story is not an exception. It is the pattern. Now let's talk about who is actually being killed, because this adds another layer of deeply troubling context. Nearly half of all known executions globally in 2025, 46%, were tied to drug-related offenses. That's 1,057 people executed for drug crimes out of the 2,707 documented worldwide. Amnesty International has been clear. Executing people for drug offenses violates international human rights law. These are not individuals convicted of violent crimes against others. And yet, in Iran, at least 795 people were put to death in 2025 for drug-related charges. Many of them were poor. Many were from marginalized ethnic minority communities, Baluchi, Kurdish, Afghan, and many were processed through revolutionary courts where human rights groups document the outcome was decided long before the trial began. Here's what the data suggests, and this is the part researchers find most chilling. The spike in drug-related executions in Iran appears to be deliberately engineered as a form of social control. Iran's own government has acknowledged at various points that the death penalty does not deter drug crimes. And yet executions for drug offenses have surged dramatically since the 2022 protests. The reasoning, according to analysts, is straightforward. Executing protesters directly draws intense international attention and backlash. But executing people labeled as drug criminals, that's harder to rally the world around. So the regime allegedly uses drug charges, charges that are easy to fabricate, easy to push through a compliant court, and hard to contest internationally. As a tool to eliminate people it views as threats and to terrorize the broader population into compliance. Let's also look at who else is on this list, because Iran is not alone in raising serious concerns. Saudi Arabia carried out at least 356 executions in 2025, exceeding its own previous record set just a year earlier. Of those, 240 were for drug-related offenses. Yemen recorded at least 51 executions. Egypt put 23 people to death. Kuwait nearly tripled its execution count, going from 6 in 2024 to 17 in 2025. And then there is the United States, which recorded 47 executions in 2025, nearly double the figure from the previous year. That increase has drawn its own attention and criticism from human rights organizations, who note that the U.S. now sits an uncomfortable statistical company on the global death penalty list alongside nations with far less robust judicial protections. The report also raises the question of China, and this is where the true global scale of the death penalty crisis becomes even more staggering to consider. Amnesty International explicitly states that its 2025 figures exclude China because China classifies the number of its executions as a state secret. The organization believes thousands of executions take place in China annually, but verifying those numbers is impossible given the secrecy of the Chinese government. What this means is that the 2,707 documented global executions in 2025 is almost certainly a significant undercount. The real number, if China's figures were included, could be dramatically higher. There are also countries where Amnesty says it could corroborate executions and death sentences, but lacked enough information to provide a credible total, including Iraq, North Korea, and Vietnam. Vietnam, like China, classifies its death penalty data as a state secret. Belarus, Laos, and North Korea provided little to no verifiable information. So the report you are reading about right now, as shocking as its numbers already are, represents only the visible portion of a much larger, darker reality. Now let's zoom back in on Iran specifically, because there are dimensions of this crisis that deserve much more attention than they have received. At least 48 women were executed in Iran in 2025, the highest number recorded in at least 2 decades. Many of these women came from impoverished backgrounds. Many had been convicted in cases involving domestic violence where courts reportedly dismissed evidence of self-defense. Some were victims of a justice system that, human rights groups say, systematically refuses to recognize the gendered dimensions of violence and vulnerability. Iran also executed at least 84 Afghan nationals in 2025. Foreign citizens, the most marginalized of the marginalized, with even less access to legal resources or international attention. 3 Iraqi nationals were also executed. Political prisoners were among those killed. Behrouz Ehsani, Mehdi Hassani, and Mehran Bahramian were executed on charges that Amnesty International described as vaguely worded and politically motivated. Charges like moharebe, which translates roughly to enmity against God, a catch-all accusation that has been applied to protesters, journalists, and activists. Since the start of the conflict with Israel and the United States, rights groups report that the number of political executions has accelerated even further into 2026. At the time of writing, Swedish-Iranian academic Ahmadreza Jalali, a man who has had his death sentence overturned by Iran's own Supreme Court 3 times, remained at serious risk of execution, having been moved to an undisclosed location following Israeli strikes on Evin prison. Women's rights defenders Sharifeh Mohammadi, Pakshan Azizi, and Varishe Maradi are reportedly under death sentences and at imminent risk. Young men who participated in the January 2026 nationwide protests are on death row. The cycle is ongoing. And here's the bigger picture that ties all of this together. For decades, there has been a slow, steady global movement away from the death penalty. Amnesty International began campaigning for its abolition in 1977, when only 16 countries had abolished capital punishment for all crimes. By the end of 2025, that number had risen to 113 countries. The direction of history across most of the world has been toward abolition. The trend is unmistakable, but a small number of governments are moving aggressively in the opposite direction. And what Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other rights organizations are warning is that this is not happening in a vacuum. It is being driven by regimes that feel threatened by their own populations, by geopolitical pressure, by the possibility of losing control. The death penalty in these contexts is not being used as a mechanism of justice. It is being used as a weapon. As Agnes Calamar, Amnesty International's Secretary General, put it directly in the report, governments are weaponizing the death penalty to instill fear, crush dissent, and show the strength state institutions have over disadvantaged people and marginalized communities. That is not justice. That is terror exercised through a legal system. Director of Iran Human Rights, Mahmoud Amiri Moghadam, offered a sobering observation. By creating fear through an average of 4 to 5 executions every single day in 2025, Iran's authorities were trying to prevent new protests and hold on to power. And yet, he noted, by the end of the year, people took to the streets again anyway. The policy of the gallows, as he called it, was failing, but the cost in human life was catastrophic. The international community's response to all of this has been, by most assessments, deeply inadequate. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk called on Iran to establish a moratorium on capital punishment and release arbitrarily detained prisoners, expressing that he was appalled by the ongoing violations. But words of condemnation, however strong, have not slowed the pace of executions. Iran's revolutionary courts continue operating. The hangings continue. Rights organizations are calling on governments around the world to pursue concrete accountability measures through universal jurisdiction, through international legal mechanisms, through sustained diplomatic and economic pressure. They are calling on the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which works with Iran on drug policy issues, to ensure that its cooperation does not in any way contribute to the conditions enabling these mass executions for drug offenses. Some legal scholars are beginning to raise the question of whether large-scale executions for drug-related offenses carried out after grossly unfair trials could constitute crimes against humanity under international law. That is the threshold the conversation has reached. Not whether Iran's record is troubling, not whether improvements could be made, but whether what is happening inside that country on a systematic, escalating, documented basis crosses the line into crimes against humanity. So here is where we are. In 2025, the world watched, mostly in silence, as Iran executed more than 6 people every single day, as a government used its own courts, its own prisons, and its own hangmen to kill over 2,000 of its citizens in the space of 12 months. As marginalized communities, drug offenders processed through secretive courts, women who defended themselves from violence, academics, activists, protesters, and people accused of political crimes were put to death at a pace the world has not witnessed since 1981. The numbers are on paper now. The report has been published. The names of the victims, those we know, are being documented by people who risk their own safety to keep records in a country where the government would prefer these deaths go unnoticed by the outside world. The question that deserves to hang in the air after all of this is not a complicated one. It is not a question of ideology or geopolitics or international relations strategy. It is a much more basic, much more human question. When the documented evidence shows that a government is executing its own people at this scale, using courts that deny defendants their most fundamental legal rights, targeting the poor and the marginalized, silencing the voices of those who dared to protest, at what point does the world decide that silence is no longer an acceptable response? What do you think needs to happen next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.